Good evening. Welcome to our second story in the Shire Chronicles, The Road to Wrenhold. Let's begin. The path eastward from Greenhill Vale was not often travelled, and as Orlen and Adric made their way across the hills, they quickly realised why. The road, once a well-trodden trade route, had grown narrow and uneven, with grass creeping over its edges and roots breaking through the packed earth. The cheerful scenery of the vale began to give way to sparser trees and rocky outcrops, the air growing cooler as they climbed toward the ridge that overlooked the eastern plains. Orlen adjusted the strap of his satchel and glanced over his shoulder, his gaze lingering on the distant outline of Greenhill Vale, now little more than a speck of green nestled among the hills. He felt a pang of homesickness, a quiet longing for the comfort of his burrow, the smell of baking bread, and the steady rhythm of his peaceful life. Adric walked ahead, his staff tapping rhythmically against the ground. He seemed far less troubled, his curiosity carrying him forward with purpose. "We're making good time," he called back, pausing to wait for Orlen. "If we keep this pace, we'll reach the crossroads by nightfall." Orlen caught up, frowning. "You're sure that's a good idea? That trader back at the fork didn't seem too keen on the place." Adric shrugged, his tone dismissive. "He's probably heard too many stories. Inns like the Crossroads get their fair share of tall tales. Ghosts in the rafters, spirits by the well. It's all meant to keep people entertained by the fire." "Maybe," Orlen said, though he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since the trader's warning. The man had been gaunt and hollow-eyed, dressed in a tattered cloak that smelled faintly of damp wood. His warning had been cryptic but clear. The crossroads is no place for travellers. Not anymore. By midday, the path brought them to a wide clearing where a large oak tree stood at the centre. Its branches stretched high into the sky, casting dappled shadows over the road. Beneath its canopy sat a small wagon laden with jars of honey, bolts of cloth, and bundles of dried herbs. A trader stood nearby, his hands busy repairing a wheel with a set of well-worn tools. He looked up as Orlen and Adric approached, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Travellers?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Heading to Wrenhold," Adric replied, gesturing toward the eastern road. The trader straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "You'll be passing the Crossroads Inn, then?" Orlen hesitated. "We've heard it's not cheap, welcoming place anymore." The trader snorted. "Welcoming? No, but shelter's shelter, and there's precious little else between here and Wrenhold. If you're going, best keep your wits about you. Folks say the woods around the inn have grown strange." "Strange how?" Adric asked. His curiosity piqued. The trader leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Shadows that move when they shouldn't. Voices in the night, and travellers who don't come back the way they came." Orlen's grip tightened on his satchel. "That doesn't sound like a place we want to stay." The trader shrugged. "Suit yourselves, but if the night catches you on the road, you'll wish for walls, haunted or not." The sun was low in the sky by the time they reached the fork where the road split in two. A weathered signpost stood at the junction, its wood cracked and leaning slightly to one side. One arrow pointed southeast, marked with the faint word Wrenhold. The other pointed east, toward the crossroads. Adric stopped, glancing between the two paths. "We could push on through the night," he said. "It's longer, but we'd avoid the inn." "And risk running into wolves, or worse," Orlen countered. He didn't like the idea of the crossroads any more than Adric did, but he knew that the woods could be treacherous after dark. Adric sighed. "You're right. Better to take the shorter path. At least we'll have a roof over our heads." Reluctantly, they turned onto the eastern road, the path narrowing as it wound its way through the thickening forest. The trees here were older, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out much of the fading light. The air grew cooler, and the faint sound of birdsong was replaced by an eerie stillness. As they walked, Orlen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, but the path behind them was always empty. "You feel it too, don't you?" Adric asked, his voice low. Orlen nodded. "Something's not right here." "Keep moving," Adric had said. "The sooner we reach the inn, the better." The Crossroads Inn appeared out of the gloom like a relic of another time. Its walls were weathered and darkened with age, and its roof sagged under the weight of years. The windows were boarded up in places, and ivy crept along its stone foundation. A faded sign swung above the door, its chains creaking in the wind. Orlen hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the iron handle. "Are we sure about this?" Adric gave him a wry smile. "It's not exactly inviting, but it'll do." Inside, the inn was dim and cold. The hearth at the far end of the room was dark, and the tables and chairs were covered in a fine layer of dust. Yet for all its abandonment, the air didn't carry the silence of an empty place. It felt expectant. Adric lit a small lantern, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. "Well," he said, his voice echoing slightly, "at least it's dry." Orlen set down his satchel and began clearing a space at one of the tables. As he worked, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic. He lifted it carefully, revealing a small iron medallion etched with the same runes that had marked the stone and the willow. Adric's lantern light flickered, and the room seemed to darken slightly. From somewhere beyond the boarded-up windows came the faint sound of footsteps. "Did you hear that?" Orlen whispered. Adric nodded, his expression grim. "We're not alone." The flickering light of Adric's lantern threw distorted shadows onto the walls of the inn, stretching and shifting like restless spirits. Orlen tightened his grip on the iron medallion, its surface cold against his palm. The runes etched into the metal seemed to catch the light oddly, their grooves glinting faintly, as though alive. "What is this doing here?" Orlen muttered, his voice low but sharp. Adric stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the medallion. "Same markings as the stone," he said, his tone equal parts fascination and concern. "Whoever left this here knew about the relics, or perhaps even sought them out." The room fell silent again, save for the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. Orlen placed the medallion carefully on the table, his fingers trembling slightly. "I don't like this," he admitted, his gaze darting to the boarded-up windows. "Something about this place feels wrong." Adric nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's more than just abandonment. It feels as though the inn itself is holding its breath." Orlen frowned but said nothing. He couldn't deny the sensation, the heavy stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. Even the air carried a strange weight, thick and cool despite the lack of any breeze. As they settled by the hearth, Adric worked quickly to light a small fire. The kindling sparked and crackled, casting warm light into the room, though it did little to ease the oppressive atmosphere. Orlen unpacked some bread and cheese from his satchel, trying to focus on the familiar comfort of a meal. "Let's just eat and rest," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "The sooner we're back on the road, the better." Adric nodded absently but seemed distracted, his gaze lingering on the medallion. He pulled out his notebook, jotting down notes and sketches by the firelight. "This inn wasn't abandoned by chance," he murmured. "Something drove people away, something tied to these symbols." Orlen didn't respond, His attention had drifted to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. He blinked, straining his eyes, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a faint, flickering shape shifting in the gloom. "Adric," he said quietly, his voice tense. Adric looked up, following Orlen's gaze. The corner appeared empty, but the unease in the room seemed to grow. Then, from beyond the boarded windows, a sound echoed through the inn, a slow, deliberate scrape, like nails dragging across wood. Both men froze. Orlen's heart pounded in his chest as the sound repeated, moving from one window to the next. Adric reached for his staff, his expression grim. "We're not alone," he whispered. Orlen nodded, gripping the hilt of his small belt knife. The scrape turned to soft thuds, as though something, or someone, was testing the boards covering the windows. The noise moved around the building, circling them before falling silent. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a sudden crash, the door to the inn rattled violently on its hinges. The door shuddered again, and this time the force splintered the frame. Orlen and Adric scrambled to their feet, backing toward the hearth as the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The door burst open and 3 figures stepped into the room. They were cloaked and hooded, their faces obscured, but their movements were unnaturally smooth, almost gliding across the floor. They made no sound, not even the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Adric raised his staff, the firelight glinting off its polished surface. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they spread out, moving deliberately as though herding the 2 men toward the center of the room. One of them raised a hand, and Orlen caught a glimpse of pale, skeletal fingers reaching toward the medallion on the table. "No, you don't," Adric growled, stepping between the figure and the table. With a swift motion, he swung his staff, striking the figure's arm. The blow connected, but the figure barely flinched, its hood turning toward Adric with an eerie stillness. The air grew colder still, and a faint whisper filled the room, a sound like wind moving through cracks in stone. Orlen's grip on his knife tightened as one of the figures turned toward him, its hollow presence pressing against his mind. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Adric struck out again, this time knocking one of the figures backward. The cloaked being stumbled but didn't fall, its movements still silent and unearthly. Orlen, driven more by instinct than courage, lunged forward with his knife, slashing at the nearest figure. To his shock, the blade seemed to glance off the figure's cloak as though striking stone. The being turned toward him, its skeletal hand reaching for his chest. Orlen staggered back, his heart pounding, and his hand brushed against the ring hidden in Adric's satchel. The moment his fingers touched the metal, a surge of warmth shot through him, and the room filled with a blinding light. The figures recoiled, their cloaks fluttering as though caught in a sudden gale. The whispering sound grew louder, then faded abruptly as the figures retreated, disappearing into the shadows beyond the open door. Orlen collapsed to his knees, the ring still clutched in his trembling hand. Adric was at his side in an instant, his expression a mixture of relief and alarm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice urgent. I don't know," Orlen stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I didn't mean to. It just happened." Adric helped him to his feet, his gaze shifting to the darkened doorway. "Whatever it was, it scared them off for now. But we can't stay here." As dawn broke, the 2 men gathered their belongings, their nerves still raw from the encounter. The medallion and the ring felt heavier than ever, their presence a constant reminder of the danger they faced. We need to get to Wrenhold, Adric said as they stepped back onto the road. And fast. Cyrana will know what to make of all this. Orlen nodded, though his thoughts lingered on the ring. The warmth he had felt, the surge of energy, had been both terrifying and oddly comforting, as though the artifact recognized him in some way. As they moved further from the inn, Orlen cast one last glance over his shoulder. The building stood silent in the morning light, its windows dark and empty. But somewhere in the woods, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker of shadow between the trees. He shuddered and quickened his pace, the path to Wrenhold feeling longer than ever. The gates of Wrenhold loomed ahead, their iron bars twisted into ornate patterns of vines and flowers. Though the town was far from grand, its walls and cobbled streets gave it an air of permanence and safety, a stark contrast to the haunting atmosphere of the Crossroads Inn. Orlen and Adric stepped through the gates just as the morning sun broke free of the hills, casting the town in warm light. Wrenhold was alive with activity. Merchants called out from their stalls, offering fresh produce, bolts of fabric and glittering trinkets. Children darted through the crowd, laughing as they played games along the cobblestone paths. Yet, despite the bustle, Orlen felt the weight of the ring and the stone pressing on his thoughts, a reminder that their journey was far from over. "We'll find Cyrana at the archive," Adric said, leading Orlen through the winding streets. "She rarely leaves the place, says it's where the past speaks clearest." Orlen raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does she do?" Adric smirked. "She calls herself a scholar, but she's more than that. Cyrana has spent her life chasing the remnants of the old world, relics, stories, secrets. If anyone knows what these symbols mean, it's her." The archive stood at the edge of town, its stone walls draped with ivy and its tall windows streaked with dust. A brass plaque near the door read simply, "Wrenhold Repository of Lore." Adric pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the two men stepped into the dimly lit interior. The scent of aged parchment and candle wax filled the air, and rows of shelves stretched toward the ceiling, packed with books, scrolls, and artifacts. At a desk near the center of the room sat a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore a cloak embroidered with runic patterns, and her sharp features gave her an air of authority. "Cyrana," Adric called out, his voice echoing softly in the quiet space. The woman looked up from the tome she was reading, her piercing grey eyes locking onto them. She rose gracefully, her cloak swirling around her. "Adric Thornbranch," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "It's been a long time, and you've brought company." "This is Orlen Mossroot," Adric said, gesturing to his companion. "We've come seeking answers, Cyrana. We found something unusual." Cyrana's gaze shifted to Orlen, lingering for a moment before she spoke. "Show me." They followed Cyrana to a small alcove lined with shelves holding strange objects, cracked masks, shards of pottery, and pieces of carved stone. A long wooden table sat in the center, illuminated by a cluster of flickering candles. Orlen set the stone and the medallion on the table, the flickering light catching the etched runes. Cyrana's expression remained calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of interest. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice low. Adric quickly recounted the events at Greenhill Vale and the Crossroads Inn. Cyrana listened intently, her fingers brushing lightly over the carvings on the stone. "These symbols," she murmured, "belong to the keepers of the hidden paths. An ancient order, long vanished. Their purpose was to guard relics like this, relics that held the power to reshape the world." "Reshape the world?" Orlen repeated, his unease growing. Cyrana nodded. "The keepers believed that the world was built on fragile foundations, These relics were created to protect those foundations, or in some cases, to destroy them. She picked up the medallion, holding it up to the light. This is no ordinary artifact. It is part of a set, each piece tied to the others. Together they form a whole, an engine of immense power. Adric frowned. And the ring? What does it do? Cyrana hesitated, her expression unreadable. That depends on who wields it. Such relics have no inherent will of their own, but they amplify the desires and intentions of those who carry them. In the wrong hands. She let the thought hang in the air. Before they could ask more, a sudden crash echoed through the archive. Cyrana turned sharply, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of a short blade hidden beneath her cloak. "What was that?" Orlen whispered, his heart pounding. Cyrana didn't answer. She moved toward the main hall with swift, silent steps, Adric and Orlen following close behind. The room was dark now, the light from the windows blocked by a heavy shadow that seemed to seep into the air itself. In the doorway stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its form indistinct but radiating an unnatural cold. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the faint scent of damp earth filled the air. Cyrana stepped forward, her blade glinting in the dim light. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And what do you want here?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and the air seemed to ripple, a low, resonant hum filling the room. Orlen staggered back, clutching the ring in his pocket as its warmth surged through him. "Orlen!" Adric shouted, grabbing his arm. "Don't let it—" The figure moved suddenly, its shadowy form surging forward like a wave. Cyrana met it head-on, her blade flashing as it struck out, but the force of the impact sent her stumbling back. Orlen felt the pull of the ring grow stronger, as though it was calling to him, urging him to act. He hesitated, torn between fear and instinct. "Orlen!" Adric's voice broke through the chaos. "We need to run, now!"